welcome back to Dr. Walls and Friends. And you know, one of the things, we're going to come back to the religious question that I asked before, but one of the hot topics that I keep hearing coming up, and it really goes with something that we deal with all the time, are the differences of how this is experienced by men and how this is experienced by women. And you know, one of the things that Anthony mentioned and a couple other panelists mentioned as well was that we each play a role in this, and that abuse, as Mary pointed out, can be from the woman towards the man. It can be verbal, it can be mental, it can be emotional as well. And we also know that it occurs within the homosexual community as well. Domestic violence is something that occurs throughout the various communities. I remember one time somebody saying, you know, I know how to push his buttons. And my response was, then you know what not to push. So, you know, as I mention this, I see some of you shaking your head. And Ebony, I'm going to go to you first. And what is it as far as having been in a relationship, and you two, you said you married, you divorced, you got the help, you made the changes, and now you're remarried again. As you reflect back on yourself, as you hold that mirror up to yourself, what did you notice?
Well, Dr. Walls, I noticed that I too had been an abuser. And even though he would tell me that, you know, after his physical bouts with me, that I was mentally and emotionally abusing him as well, I wouldn't listen, because I felt like, you know, well, words don't hurt as bad as physical bruises. But once he took the chance to get help, and I went to him on some of his sessions, I had to realize too that, like you said, sometimes we can push their buttons. We know what to say just at that right moment in time to make them explode. You know, we may not be doing it on purpose all the time, but just to continue either arguing or to get our point across. And it's just as bad as physical abuse. There's times where, you know, women, we may not think so, but we may even be out in public and just demeaning to our husbands or our spouses. That's enough to make them feel either not loved, not wanted, and they're humans, they're people too. You know, they may not show it, but they have a lot of emotion. They have a lot of feelings. And to have someone feel like that at my hand, it hurt me to know that somebody that I love, not intentionally, but out of anger and retaliation, I was doing these things. I was saying things that would hurt him. I was saying things that would, you know, strike a chord, get under his skin, make him feel less of a man because I was hurt. I felt like this was what I needed to do to show him how bad I was feeling. But in turn, it was only feeding fuel to the fire. And I had to step back after our separation and really look at things that I could have changed. In wanting to help him, I also needed to help myself. It's not going to be a one-sided thing. And a lot of times it's never a one-sided thing. We do put a lot of blame on the men, but you can't argue with yourself. A lot of times you can't. If you walk away from a situation, it will de-escalate. Men and women, take time out, get your thoughts together, walk away from the situation if possible. If not possible, you have to barricade yourself in a room so that you both can get a moment to each other to get your thoughts together, come back to reality in that sense, and try to start it all over again. It's better than continuing to add that fuel to the fire, because you are in turn, you are an abuser just as well, and it's not right.
And I think one of the things, and thank you for sharing that, and one of the things we have to understand that relationships, each relationship is different. So that may be the reality for some people's relationships. And then for other people's relationships, they may be being attacked and there isn't a trigger. The person who's doing the attacking is responding to something outside of the people who are within that household. And so, as people are going to get help, either individually as the person who's doing the abusing, the person who's being abused, people who are in the relationship pattern of abuse. Mary, what are some ways, as a marriage and family therapist, what are some ways or some guidance that you can provide for people to seek the appropriate type of therapy that they need?
Thank you, Dr. Walls. That is so instrumental in regards to picking or selecting the person that's going to take you through this journey, because you have to make sure that if it's a spiritual person that you're going to, if it's secular training, you have to ensure that they have a value system that has no judgment. That even if they don't believe in something, that they are going to take the perspective of neutrality, but that they truly understand the different roles that people play. They understand the trauma. They understand all the people who can be impacted between the support system, the individual, the children, your work, your community activities, like everything that surrounds you in a systemic way that is impacted by the trauma that you're experiencing from the violence in your home, that they're going to understand to empower you versus to blame you and tell you that you're wrong. Like if you hear anything that's negative, you're repeating the process in the therapeutic situation while you're supposed to be getting counseling. So when you're making the phone call, when you're doing your research online to select who that person is that you'll receive your counseling, ask them if they're familiar with dealing with trauma. Ask them if they're familiar with empowerment counseling. Empowerment counseling is something that is nationwide in regards to working with individuals who experience and sustain domestic violence. Also being sensitive to like just the trigger traps, because the trigger traps is like what you were talking about with the words and the actions and the things that you do, but it's so many things in the environment that set off. That is not just the interaction between someone else, but the interaction that someone has within their brain that is communicating that violence.
And as we're talking about this, and I know we have two more panelists who are getting ready to disappear. Y'all don't think I'm a magician or something, right? Two more panelists who have to get ready to make a shift. And we are going to come back and talk about the religious institution pieces. I definitely want to give a couple more statistics and just definitions of abuse. Because there's one type of abuse which was mentioned, but it kind of got overlooked, and it happens very often. And there's a song that comes to my head by one of Philadelphia's own, Jasmine Sullivan. Go ahead, I see people's heads moving. I'm going to went to your windows. I'm going to bust the windows out your car. Right? And so there's stalking. And stalking is a type of abuse. And it happens a lot. And, many times it gets overlooked as a type of violence, but stalking is a type of violence. And some of the statistics around that is that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 19 men in the United States have experienced stalking victimization at some point during their lifetime, in which they felt very fearful or believed that they or someone close to them would be harmed or killed. 2/3 of female victims of stalking were stalked by a current or former intimate partner. Men are primarily stalked by an intimate partner or acquaintance. Repeatedly receiving unwanted telephone calls, voice, or text messages was the most commonly experienced stalking tactic for both male and female victims of stalking. An estimated 10.7% of women and 2.1% of men have been stalked by an intimate partner during their lifetime. And we end up using that word stalking. How many times do we even hear children or teens talk about stalking, and we use it so commonplace that it loses really the essence and the power and the dangerousness behind it. Oh, I'm gonna just stalk him. Don't worry, and I'm gonna get my girlfriend to help me too. Girl, I saw him over there, and this and that. Next thing you know, you surrounded his car, and then next thing you know, his car has new designs on it that he did not purchase or ask you to put on there. And so, But this is a form of abuse. They don't know that it's happening and people are doing it. And so we have to understand when we go back to the root definition of abuse, that it is power and coercion over someone. We have to go back to that definition. And then, so what do we do to flip it? What do we do to flip it? And that's what we're going to talk about on the other side, establishing those healthy relationships. How can the church, how can the synagogue, how can the mosque, how can these forms of spirituality, how can they help? How can our support systems help? So we're going to take a break. We're going to come back with Mike Andreas, who's going to give us one step, which is learning self-defense. All right? And then after that, we're going to close out with the panel discussion. All right, so we'll be back shortly on Dr. Walls and Friends.